good to be back again at the Humanist House. A beautiful name, and it's been great that you've been renting this place and made it available. I really applaud all of your efforts that you've done with the American Humanist Association. This morning we're going to be talking about humanism because an essential part of humanism is meeting people's human needs. In Human Agenda, I'm the executive director of Human Agenda. We call ourselves eco-humanists, although we could use a bunch of ism names out there. But it really comes down to how do we meet the needs of the planet and how do we meet the needs of human beings. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about 10 policies in Cuba that we do not have in the United States that go a long way in terms of meeting the needs of the Cuban people and the needs also of Cuba geographically, ecologically. So in addition to being the executive director of Human Agenda, I'm an immigration attorney, and I'd like the other two people who are presenting with me to present themselves right now also.
Hi, I'm Lisa Felberg. I'm a retired library worker and just been a political activist for most of my life. A little retired from that now and finally got to go going to Cuba off my bucket list.
My name is Rachel Cast. I'm from San Jose. I'm a social worker, and I also went on the trip in June, and it was life-changing, so I'm really glad we get to talk a little bit about that with you guys.
And speaking of which, for anybody who's interested, we are returning to Cuba on January 11th for a 9-day trip to Cuba. There's information on the table. So these are the 10 policies that we're going to be looking at today, and we'll be going through them one at a time. Last night we gave a presentation at the San Jose Peace and Justice Center, and it took us an hour and a half, so we're going to be moving quite a bit quicker today. The first one is a little bit complicated to understand, but the 19th century Cuban philosopher José Martí developed this phrase of unite to win. And it really has been a part of Cuban politics and morality and folklore for the last 150 years, because the Cubans, having fought a war of independence against Spain and a neo-colonial war of independence against the United States, recognize that unless they're united, they're smashed. They're over. You know, the revolution is done. And so this is a concept that's foreign to many people, but it's really important. In terms of, first of all, I'm sure all of you know that Cuba was basically a U.S. colony from the time of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the Monroe Doctrine, the 1850s. In all of these cases, the presidents and the leaders of the United States said, Cuba belongs to us. By the 1880s, 83% of Cuban exports went to the United States. Cuba was definitely a U.S. colony. Later on, at the time of the Cuban-American the U.S.-Spanish War, which it's interesting when we study the U.S.-Spanish War, we don't call it the U.S.-Spanish-Cuban War. It was about the independence of Cuba, and yet Cuba is not even mentioned as one of the countries in the name of that war. That just shows how Cuba was neglected by the United States, and it continues to be neglected in terms of our understanding of what was really going on when thousands of Cubans fought for independence in 1898, and yet the U.S. took all of the credit for winning the war, quote-unquote, against Spain. At the signing of the quote-unquote Spanish American agreement, Cuba was not a participant in the signing, and as you can see under the Platt Amendment, which came into effect in 1901, I think you can read it, the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence. Does that make any sense to you at all? But I think we know what this means. The U.S. controls Cuba. Under Batista, which is the regime that Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement ultimately overthrew in the 1950s, the national debt quadrupled and hundreds of millions of dollars left the country, a lot of it into accounts of Batista. There's an interesting quote by JFK during his presidential campaign. He said that the reality is that it was Batista who was destroying the last vestiges of freedom and stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the Cuban people. Thus, it was our own policies, not those of Castro, that first began to turn our former neighbor against us. Of course, within a year or two, JFK completely turned and, of course, opposed the Cuban Revolution. Once Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement came into power on January 1st, 1959, we see a number of steps that the United States took against the Cuban government, especially after Cuba decided to socialize the entire economy of Cuba and expropriate United Fruit, the telephone company, and all of the monopolies that the U.S. capitalist class owned in Cuba. This included the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, sabotage, including support for the blowing up of an airliner, the blowing up of a boat, 600 assassination attempts on the life of Fidel Castro, the longest blockade that's ever existed in the history of the world. It's now going on 56 years, which includes, by the way, blockading any third country that dares to trade with Cuba. U.S. aid has received tens of millions of dollars. The Helms-Burton bill in 1997 basically said that the United States would not deal or recognize Cuba as long as there was a Castro in power. As long as, by the way, for the first time this year, there is no Castro in power. As long as the United States could define the word democracy for Cuba, and the International Monetary Fund could not be involved. So this is a picture outside of the airport in Havana, the longest genocide in history. So why do you think the Cubans are united, given that history with the United States? It's been an elephant versus an ant. The Cubans have been seeking their own sovereignty and independence for the last 200 years. They have now developed a socialist society, and we'll talk about what that actually means in terms of the gains of the revolution. And so the goal is to develop a free Cuba and meeting the needs of the human people. In order to be able to continue in power, I would say, unlike the Soviet Union, unlike China today even, there have been mass organizations that have been organized democratically from the very beginning of the revolution. In fact, the CDRs, which is the symbol on the right, the Committees in the Defense of the Revolution, are organized block by block in Cuba. They are there to defend the revolution, and also if Cuba recognizes that if the United States ever did start dropping bombs or invading Cuba, that the only answer would be guerrilla warfare in the long run. So CDRs are set up to be a kind of block by block defense of the revolution. In addition, ANAP is for agriculture, the CTC is the Confederation of Workers, then there's a youth organization, on the far right a women's organization. So Cubans, all Cubans are organized into mass organizations, something that we have no concept of really in the United States of America. And they play an active role on many different policy levels. This is at the Federation of Cuban Women's that we visited in Cardenas, and these are some of the provincial leaders of the Federation of Women. And so people's power which almost nobody knows about in the United States of America, was developed as a democratic way to elect municipal, provincial, and national leadership in Cuba. And so there are assemblies at all three of these levels. It's the sole body with legislative power in Cuba. Since 1992, there's been direct popular election at the provincial and national levels also. The Cuban Communist Party is not an electoral party and cannot nominate candidates. There is no formal campaigning. Every election, of course, is corporate-free because there are no corporations per se in Cuba, which is a big difference from our country and Citizens United in 2010, right? Where corporations now in this country can give unlimited amounts of money anonymously to candidates in the United States. It's completely different in Cuba. The voting, as you can see, has been in the 90s and above. The first election had 99.6% participation of the people of Cuba. And to move on, this is a picture of the Provincial Assembly of People's Power. And this is actually how candidates are announced. There is a single piece of paper in a public place where each candidate puts their biography, and people make a decision accordingly based upon that. This is an example. This is a polling place I visited in Cuba in last November in 2017. The children guard the ballot boxes. And in the 2018 vote, on March 11th, 2018, the National Assembly was elected. And as you can see, prior to the election, Raul Castro declared that he would not be seeking a new term. And a new president of the Council of State was elected. His name is Miguel Díaz-Canel. So now they have a younger president. I think he's 58 years old. The National Assembly elects a Council of State, and that Council of State of 7 people, which includes a 19-year-old black woman from Cardenas, then as a group make decisions. Even though the president is the person who calls the meetings, he makes no decision on himself. There is no president of Cuba. There is a president of the Council of State, which is elected by the members of the National Assembly, and they make a decision. They try to reach consensus on all decisions, but they ultimately decide by majority vote. These are the latest results of the election, over about 86% in the last election. The second area I want to talk about briefly is the fact that Cuba, unlike the United States, has a human rights-based constitution. In the United States, as we know, we got our 10 Bill of Rights, which are civil and political rights, but you will find absolutely nothing in the U.S. Constitution with respect to the right to education, the right to health care, the right to a home, the right to a job, the rights of nature, and all of this is included in the Cuban Constitution. So Cuba incorporates all of these economic, social, and cultural rights that are not included in our U.S. Constitution. The rights of nature are guaranteed in Article 27, which states, "It is the duty of citizens of Cuba to contribute to the protection of the waters, atmosphere, the conservation of the soil, flora, fauna, and nature's entire rich potential." The Constitution is a living document. For example, the 2002 special provisions that went to the entire Cuban people through a referendum process. They declared the irrevocability of the socialist character, political system, and social content. And this was as a response to George Bush. In 2018, right now, they are once again what they call updating the Constitution. They recognize that they need to keep up constitutionally with the times. And so, as we speak, today. All of the Cuban people at their workplaces, in their schools, in their homes, on the street, people are discussing a whole series of changes to the Cuban Constitution. They were collected through mass organizations, brought before the National Assembly. The National Assembly now has taken those recommendations out to the people again. The entire Cuban population is debating and discussing, and in February of 2019, there will be a national referendum to update the Cuban Constitution. Do we have anything like that going on in the United States?
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Cuban economy, which is a really big issue, and it's been throughout Cuba's history. So pre-revolution, you can really sum up Cuba's economy with one word, and that's sugar. They were a huge sugar-producing colony, basically. When the United States became the most influential neighbor, the United States had a quota. They would commit to buying a certain amount of sugar from Cuba at a certain price. And in return, the companies that owned the sugar were U.S. companies, and they made sure that the resource kept coming. So when the revolution happened, it actually wasn't explicitly communist or Soviet. They began doing land reform. And they began by socializing they socialized the telephone company. The telephone company was owned by a United States corporation and charged really high rates, so they nationalized that. However, when the revolution happened, the U.S. immediately cut off relations with Cuba. Cuba got all their oil through the United States. That powered their factories, that powered their cars, and that was cut off as well. So what ended up happening was Cuba talked to Soviet Russia, and Soviet Russia agreed to give them oil. The oil-producing companies, or the refineries on Cuba, were all owned by American companies, and they refused to process this oil for Cuba. At that point, those were socialized. Those were expropriated, taken over by the Cuban government. So it was kind of a slower process than I think you might think. Cuba did align itself with Russia. They ended up with basically a Soviet-style economy. So all the factories were government factories. All the workers were working for the government, essentially. So more or less, they were kind of serving the same role for the Soviet Union. They were sending tons of sugar to the Soviet Union, in return getting subsidies, getting manufactured goods. And this worked out fine up until when the Soviet Union collapsed. So when you talk to people in Cuba, this is a part of their lives they will really remember. They called this the special period. Post the Soviet collapse. And basically, they lost everything. Simultaneously, the world sugar price collapsed. So they had tons of sugar, no place to sell it, nobody who would buy it. The United States, of course, did not want to purchase things from Cuba. And they really didn't have the capacity to make their own industrial goods. So what happened at this time was, it was really hard. People they didn't have gasoline. They went back sometimes to using horses and carts to do their agriculture or to get around. There was food shortages. It was really hard. So at that point in time, they realized, well, it's just Cuba now. There's no outside source that is supporting us. And we need to somehow change the way our economy is set up, because this is not sustainable. So in 2011, it took a while, they actually ended up approving two different kinds of employment. So there was always kind of, say, a black market, right? There are always people who would, say, cut hair in exchange for a little bit of money in their home or whatever, and that wasn't officially sanctioned by the government. But in 2011, they allowed what's called self-employment. So that barber now doesn't have to go join like a government salon, basically. They can run their own small business. They get a license and they have to pay taxes, but it is legal, it's allowed. That person can have up to 2 different employees under them, but there are a lot more restrictions than in the United States. They also allowed non-governmental cooperative organizations. So they always had agricultural co-ops, but now they're allowing co-ops for all different types of businesses. So what's happened is they have moved from an entirely government-controlled economy. Now there are about 600,000 Cubans who are self-employed, who are working for themselves, which is a huge jump in less than 10 years. So they have more economic growth, but along with this they have growing disparity. So this is one of the places we visited. It's called Arte Corte. It's actually, it's a barbershop. So this is set up on a street in Havana that has lots of kind of model, independent, small businesses, basically. This young man is Camilo. He spoke to us about the different changes that are coming. He felt very positively about this. I think the tour group were all fairly left-leaning, and we had some reservations about, you know, people being able to own their own businesses and collect money. He was basically pointing out, so Cuba has a lot of great things, right? They have education and healthcare, all sorts of things that are paid for, but a lot of their young people are leaving to go to either the United States or Mexico or other countries. And basically it's because they can't make money in Cuba. So his viewpoint was he thinks that Cuba can keep all their great social programs and allow people to work on their own and accumulate capital on their own. And he thinks that that's inevitable to keep Cuba going. So they had actually frozen new licenses while we were there. And right now, they're working through the Constitution, they're seeing how far they want to go with this, you know. How much do they want to allow people to run their own businesses? Right, and then next, Richard will talk about cooperatives.
This is my last piece of the day. So when we've gone to Cuba, every time we have visited the new non-agricultural cooperatives, they tend to be in the areas of construction, restaurant, and also the biggest buses in Havana are a cooperative also, as well as a number of other small businesses like barbershops, beauty salons, etc. This new law went into effect in 2012. It is experimental, so it's not designed to be necessarily long-term, although every co-op did get, for example, a 10-year lease on the land. You can see some of the goals. They want co-ops to be sustainable. All co-ops are required to give back to the community. Obviously, they're run democratically. These are big advances over the state-owned large enterprises in Cuba. And so they're intentionally trying to decentralize the economy in Cuba to make it more democratic and also to create efficiencies because they recognize that a lot of the state enterprises were not that efficient. So these new Cuban co-ops develop relationships and contracts with other co-op state enterprises and individuals. What's really unique about Cuba is imagine the state giving land and buildings, and in the case of buses, the actual buses to a co-op in order to get off the ground as a co-op. And so this is really unique, I think, on planet Earth, where the state sector is actually turning over the key means of production for a co-op in order to be able to develop and survive. To be a co-op member, you need to be at least 18 members, and founding members of a new co-op must have the co-op approved by the local organs of people's power. So co-ops are not completely independent from planning in Cuba. They are connected to the planning mechanisms of people's power, the municipal assembly, the regional assembly, and the national assembly. The General Assembly, like in all cooperatives worldwide, is the highest decision-making body. They elect a president, a substitute, and a secretary. They exercise their own fiscal controls. The initial capital comes from their own members, but also from bank loans and the state. Unlike the United States, Cuba has a public bank, which is another area that really could be looked at as a best practice, because there's a huge movement now in California to try to create a public bank. Jim Bell just recently said he would carry a bill to that effect. Revenue is distributed to co-op members at the end of each fiscal period, so all of the profit is distributed among the worker owners who have one vote in the cooperative. And of course, the prices and the salaries are set by the co-op members. In the case of Cuba, these are some of the cooperatives that we visited, including ceramic, a recycling plant, a restaurant, also a print shop cooperative. These are some of the cooperatives that we visited. In the space of 5 years, Cuba has successfully incubated 400 successful co-ops with 50,000 members, which is more than any country in Latin America has ever done in the history of Latin America. Last weekend I was a participant in the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, their national conference in Los Angeles. And right now in the United States, we have 400 co-ops, about 400 co-ops in the United States of America. Not a very large segment of the economy, but it is a growing segment. There's a new national law to support the development of co-ops in the United States. But so Cuba is recognizing the value of the efficiency and the democratic nature of co-ops, unlike our large corporations that are anything but democratic and egalitarian. These co-ops are all of that. Go ahead.
You're skipping, I know. We're trying to go really, really quick, as you can tell, and we're only touching. Anyway, rights to housing. In 1960, there was an urban reform law passed that eliminated multiple ownership. Renters could buy their units, and the state was responsible for providing housing. Private renting and subletting was prohibited. Units built after 1961 were assigned leases of no more than 10% of the maximum household income, and after 5 to 20 years you would own your own home. 1/2 of urban tenants became homeowners. From 63 to 75, there was a lot of construction, primarily in the rural areas. There were micro-brigades that did rural dwellings and also rural communities, 600 rural communities that were created. As infrastructure was created, more people moved to the cities. The Cuban Constitution in 76 actually stated that it was a goal in providing each family with adequate dwelling, and it's based on need, not on income. Housing law, well, we'll just skip that. In the 80s, there was a lot of emphasis on prefab construction, and also homeowners became responsible for maintenance. In 87, there was community organizations and social brigades, again, working with international support and on their own to build more housing. 1990s, the emphasis changed to preservation and rehab. There was a lot of rehab, not enough housing. Previously, the population increase was much less than the housing increase, but it became an issue. In May 2000, foreigners could begin to rent rooms, and then, of course, in 2013, with the economic changes, people could rent units in their own areas. The highlights, unlike here, 85% of Cubans own houses. They may be a little bit crowded and multi-generational, and they may not be as maintained as well, but people have housing. I didn't see a single street person or homeless, unlike here where at every freeway intersection and on the streets we see people living in carts and tents. And another really cool thing, Richard mentioned the Cuban National Bank. They provide personal loans, they're not mortgages, with just 2 to 3% interest and 10 to 25-year terms. Don't require a down payment. Another thing that any working family or non-working family would really appreciate here in the U.S. I didn't go personally, or the tour didn't, on housing. We just driving, you can see the difference between more high-rise apartments on the right and some of the older type of housing in Cuba. Okay, let's go to healthcare. Cuba has a national healthcare system. There are no private hospitals or clinics. In the early 60s, there was a mandate for universal healthcare with the focus on preventative medicine, hygiene, and political participation. And this was really a challenge since so many doctors left after the revolution. In 1976, Article 50 of the Cuban Constitution and the Public Health Act of 1983 created a whole rural medical service network. They developed clinics and polyclinics, hospital special treatment centers. Since 2000, there have been increasing laws to expand rights to leave for fathers, more rights for working mothers in terms of support if they decide to go back to work earlier, and also involving grandparents. There are 3 levels of medical care in Cuba. Primary care revolves around health promotion and protection and minor health issues. This covers about 80% of the medical needs. They developed the clinics and polyclinics. Since 1984, a nurse and a doctor has been assigned to every 150 families. And this medical staff live in the clinics or live in the neighborhoods that they serve. So they become an integral part of the community. Doctors are also assigned to visit facilities such as schools, senior centers, or factories. Secondary care is patient hospitalization, and the tertiary care, which accounts for about 5% of the medical needs, is the severe illness, chronic conditions, and there are also specialized hospitals. There's 4 levels of continuous assessment. Everybody is evaluated, and there are regular home visits on semi-annual or annual basis, as well as if a medical issue is present or a patient needs follow-up. The staff are integrated. They're checking on the living situation. Are there any interpersonal situations that might need attention, such as abuse or lack of hygiene, etc. And community education is extremely important, so that they might combine things like low-impact exercises for seniors, but there's also blood checks, and then they set aside a little bit of time for community education on disease or importance of breastfeeding, often intergenerational, to meet needs. And so basically what I found is there's total integration of both health personnel, the medical school, and the whole healthcare system. We were able to visit ELAB, the Latin American Medical School. It is the largest medical university in the world. It was a humanistic and solidarity project funded by Fidel to respond to needs faced in Latin America during Hurricanes Mitch and George in 1998, where there were 30,000 victims. These populations were affected every day more by the hurricane of, quote, poverty and disease than any hurricane. And so the focus of any study on healthcare talked about the needs for doctors, and therefore Cuba committed to train medical personnel who would return to their countries to provide medical care. The medical school opened in 1999 with almost 2,000 students from 18 countries. The goal had been to train 500 to 600 doctors a year, but in 10 years they trained 10,000, and now they're approaching the 30,000 levels. Currently, there are students from 85 countries. Pastors for Peace have sponsored 172 North Americans, including 4 young women that we met with briefly. And all of this medical education is totally free of charge. There's the women that we met from various parts of the U.S. and a brief picture of the medical school. Just basically, it's a 6-year program. The biggest challenge is language and the difference in educational levels because people are coming from all sorts of different countries. They study Spanish and pre-med, and right from the beginning, everything is integrated in terms of study and practice. They do the health screenings, they do community surveys and evaluation, and they work at all the different levels of medical care I mentioned before. Just to say, Cuba has more medical personnel in the developing world than all the G8 countries combined, and currently they are in 68 countries with 25,000 Cuban doctors. We visited a neurological development center. We're not going to have time to go over that, but that was in the Matanzas province. They're training people to be functional. The doctor on the left here, Dr. Jorge Rodriguez, who founded the clinic in 2002, knew the name of every single patient and parent in the room, and they had a history of working with everybody. On the right is an example of I think it's manipulative work that they do. And then here, just to end health, is a statistical comparison. Maternity leave, you can see they're off for 7.5 months, 70% of salary after 3 months. In our country, there is no national paid policy. There are 12 weeks of unpaid FMLA. But I did see a statistic that there's a high percentage of women that don't even qualify for that. Sick leave nationally, none is required. In Cuba, they're guaranteed full pay up to 30 days in 3 years. You can see on breastfeeding, immunizations, contraception, Cuba has a much higher rate than we do. Life expectancy is equivalent, which is, of course, a little bit surprising for a Latin American country. And another great statistic, doctors per 10,000, Cuba has 76, the U.S. has 26. Again, not in our communities, not involved with preventative medicine, not working for health and not for profit. All right, on to education. This is whizzing by here. Major goal of the revolution began with the literacy brigades, where 1 million volunteers were sent throughout the country, feeling that there's a duty to educate others. Cuba has still maintained that high literacy rate at 99.7%. The U.S. had a hard time trying to find statistics, but there was a 2003 study which they said has not improved much, where at least 14% of U.S. adults are below basic literacy, and 29% are only at basic literacy. Something I learned in my research is that Cuba has the highest percentage of budget worldwide dedicated to education, which is 13%. There's free education at all levels, including graduate school. School councils are made up of directors, parents, teachers, and specialists. So again, you have the integration of total society, everybody, all sorts of different interests, people working and focused together. Their goal is to enhance and develop feelings, not just thoughts, and to be aware of cognitive and affective domains. What we do might affect what somebody else does. We need to care about each other. There is core subject curriculum, but it's adapted to each local situation. So maybe a school in Havana might have a little bit different focus than a school in the East countryside. And within their educational system, they have students and also some of the council people working to develop small research projects that, again, can improve and help with educational needs. Not going to... And here we met with an association of pedagogists from Cuba, 3 people on the right, and this was some of the murals and from their building. They were very involved with helping to create the curriculum and doing assessment and evaluation on educational needs. School goes through 9th grade, and then people are divided between technical and vocational or pre-university. Teachers have a 5-year course of study, and then 3 years for master's and 4 for PhD. And they're just working on improving and assessing the education system and valuing and making distance education more accessible. And then we just visited a special education school. Just an example, 70 children with moderate intellectual abilities and some autistic kids. Through the 9th grade, 34 staff. The curriculum included history and subjects, speech therapy, psychologists, PE, art, library, workshops. They also had a garden that they grew, harvested, and cooked with, and did home chores so that less functional children could learn to cook, make a bed, clean, etc. And students do have a little better diet than adults. They get more yogurt and milk and have after-school workshops. And this is the special ed students working on projects in the classroom. You can see our interpreter on the right, and students playing dominoes with a sink in the back so we can talk about washing dishes, hygiene, washing hands, etc. A little bit daily activity.
So Cuba has always had kind of a unique focus on the environment. Castro had a commitment to the environment starting with the revolution. In 1968, they started a reforestation program. So before colonization, about 90% of Cuba was covered with trees. When the revolution happened, that was down to about 10%. So they started reforesting a couple of places. At this point, I guess there's about 30% of the land is covered with trees. We went to visit one of the first places that was reforested. It's called Las Terrazas, where basically they created terraces all down this giant mountain, replanted. It's now full of native Cuban species. There's also a small town there. So another thing, when the special period happened, Cuba actually had to kind of become green in their agriculture because they didn't have access to chemical fertilizers or things like that. So during that period, they really had to innovate and work with what they had, and they ended up with kind of a model agricultural system. So they do a lot of urban farming where they use disused land in the city to try to put high yield of vegetables and fruits. So in Havana, about 30% of the fruits and vegetables that they consume are actually grown within the city, which it cuts down on fuel cost for transportation. It's really pretty good. So this is Las Terrazas. You can kind of see it's a beautiful area. It's now actually mainly a tourist area for other Cubans to come and visit. This is the town, and then there's also the preserve where they study the animals, and they had like a little scientific place there that we went to visit. So another thing that the Cubans themselves didn't talk about that much, but which we perceived was the amount of recycling that happens. So, as Richard said, the blockade doesn't just mean that the U.S. won't trade with Cuba. It means that any other country or company that trades with Cuba will potentially be punished by the United States. So, for Cuba to get basic things that they need for society, they have to find someone who's willing to risk that, which is pretty hard. So a lot of what they do is recycle. If you go to Cuba, you will see cars from the 50s that look like they're new. People have just repaired them over and over through the years. So this is actually one of the cooperatives we visited. It used to be part of the government services, but is now independent. Then they refurbish vans for various use for the government. So you can see, I mean, basically on the left-hand side, they get things like this, and then they repair them to look like the right-hand side. In the United States, something like that, we would throw it away. But in Cuba, it's kind of the restrictions have led them to be really innovative. Also, this was a story we heard from quite a few Cubans, just to emphasize the blockade. They looked around a bunch for an option for public transportation. They wanted buses. So they found a company in England that would sell them these buses. So they bought a fleet, and then the United States actually went out of its way to buy this company so that they wouldn't be able to get any replacement parts. So it's really, they really have a hard time getting basic materials. So they make do, they recycle, they turn what is, hard times, they have to be creative. So gun-free security, I'm sorry, this is actually wrong. Not very many civilians own guns. You can apply for a license for hunting, but it's really rare to get it. So Cuba actually has some harsh punishments for certain crimes. They have really harsh punishments for gun crimes, and they have really harsh punishments for dealing or doing drugs. And what we heard is, Cuba is right in the middle of the drug trade from South America to the United States. They have tons of harbors. They really don't want to be part of that system. They do not want to have cartels interested in them. So if somebody is smuggling drugs or participating in that, they get punished really severely. So overall, Cuba has a very low level of crime. Especially murders are very low compared to other Central American countries. They're really way low. Oh, okay. Okay, let's move on to... Do you not want...
Go ahead.
Okay, just real quick. My impression as first-time visitor to Cuba and everything I've read is that we all notice there are no billboards. There are only store signs and a display of products in the store. I saw one small print logo on a frame of a community announcement. That was it. No TV commercials. In the United States, we have 13 to 16 minutes per hour. In Cuba, there are public service announcements only. There's no branding. There's no competition of products. Chicken is chicken, rice is rice, canned goods are canned goods. So that makes it simple because we are not a consumer society and the values are not that way. All we saw was basically political and solidarity murals throughout the country. I have heard that there is advertising for tourism products, and for export, I did not see any of those advertisements. And just to end up in Cuba, in the U.S., we have a $206 billion advertising budget. We're told what we have to have, how we should look. We need this, we need that. But what those things are mainly wants, not needs. And of course, we're bombarded every day, driving, on the TV, in the newspaper. Our newspapers are all commercials, our TVs all commercials, our computers and iPhones are all commercials.
So does anybody have any questions? Yes. You guys sit down.
Could an American be allowed to migrate to Cuba?
Yes, I do know a little bit, not a lot. I'm an immigration attorney, but for U.S. laws, not Cuban laws. But I do know of Americans who have primarily through marriage or through political asylum gained lawful permanent residence and then citizenship in Cuba.
What if we all moved to Cuba?
I don't think Cuba could take us all. Who's next?
Here. I have two questions. One, the first one is regarding energy and energy independence. You had said that Cuba doesn't have resource on its own. When the Soviet Union existed, they were getting oil, basically, as their energy source. I'm just curious, since they are a sugar economy, I just spent 10 years in Brazil, and Brazil developed sugarcane ethanol, which is much more energy efficient and ecologically friendly than corn ethanol that we use in the United States. As a sugar economy, it seems like Cuba could run on ethanol. Not only that, in Brazil, the ethanol producers actually make more money by selling the electricity they generate from burning the bagasse, the leftover from the sugar cane. So it seems like Cuba could almost become energy independent if there's such a large sugar economy by both ethanol for vehicles and electricity by burning the sugarcane residue. The second question I have is, is there access to, I guess, the digital world, internet, and the equipment? I understand that it's very hard for Cuba to get goods. I assume that would also include technology like iPhones and things like that. Is there access, and does the population have access to both the internet and the devices to access the internet?
Sure. So as to the first question, so they actually, Cuba is focused on renewable energy at this point. I think they have a goal of getting like 25% of their energy from renewable sources by 2030. It's interesting, I did read about, they haven't emphasized the ethanol too much. I read that Fidel Castro was worried about putting energy needs versus food needs.
But that is actually not an issue in a sugar economy.
Yeah, they don't. They've tried to move away from the absolute use of sugar. They're using wind and solar power.
Yeah, that's very
mainly.
hard to run vehicles on.
Okay, so for the second question, as compared to access to the internet, it is hard to get the internet there. There are local, kind of what they call hotspots, which we went to one, and they have computers set up. The computers, I had never seen that brand of computer before. They told us they got them from Japan. They were Japanese computers made for Japan, especially, and somehow they managed to get some of these. So those computers did have the internet. We saw people playing World of Warcraft, and we saw people on Facebook. That was a big one. You have to pay per minute. You buy this card. You use the card number, and then it counts down the minute on the screen. A lot of people had smartphones. I assume a lot of stuff comes from family in the United States. A lot of people were coming over, even on the plane, they were visiting with like these huge packages of things. So I'm assuming that's where most of the phones came from. They're just starting to install the internet in private homes in Havana. But Cubans do not have a lot of expendable income. It's really expensive for them to get the internet in their homes. It's basically, at this point, it seems like it's experimental. They're seeing if there's enough demand. But if you want the internet, you can get it. It's not like here. It's not constantly at your fingertips. But yeah, kids were playing video games, so.
I have a question about materials that were I volunteered a couple of years for driving vehicles, picking up stuff to go to Cuba, and then later picked up stuff in Canada to bring here that had come from Cuba. But one of the issues, real needs, was medical equipment that was really a challenge to get. And we were focusing on that when we could. Has that improved? Do they have sources available?
I don't think so. I mean, that in the clinic, in the medical school, everywhere we went, I mean, the biggest need is for supplies and infrastructure equipment, and yes, the need is still very great.
Are there ways that interested individuals could help with that?
That is a great question. When we were at the neurological clinic, they said they somehow got shipment from Canada, right? Of MRIs.
Germany was helping.
Yeah. My impression was there's no official way to do this. They kind of had to find a strange kind of law circumventing way to find this stuff.
Through nonprofits, not through governments or companies.
Yeah, and we did see, we were staying next to a place that had one of the buses that used to go from the U.S. Yeah, so they're still trying it. I guess they do get turned away sometimes, but it's still a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, locally, if you knew David Wald, he refurbished about 1,000 computers here in San Jose and took them to Cuba, primarily through Pastors for Peace.
For the medical system.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
Question relative to China. It just seems to me that would be a logical connection for Cuba, and certainly they might even have running a blockade issue that would be quite interesting.
So there are a number of countries that Cuba trades with, and among those are Brazil, China, obviously Venezuela. They get most of their oil from Venezuela. They basically trade medical personnel for oil. It's a barter system with Venezuela. They get oil from Venezuela, and Venezuela has, I believe, as many as 10,000 medical personnel. I mean, the entire infrastructure of Venezuela is Cuban medical personnel. I did want to just say real quickly that the Cubans are, with these experiments, recognizing that inequality is growing in the Cuban society. When you mentioned China, it made me think. Because as we know, income inequality in China is growing in leaps and bounds. And in Cuba, through the discussion they're having today in terms of the referendum on the Constitution, they're discussing how to put limits on that growing inequality. So, for example, in Cuba, you can only own one home. You can only own one business. There are limits as to how big your business can become, although there's no limits on the number of employees. When you have more employees, you're taxed at a much higher rate than when you have a few employees. So Cuba is very aware of the growing inequality that private property and small businesses can create, and they're trying to create limits on that inequality, at the same time recognizing that personal and cooperative initiative is the best way to create wealth. That it's actually one of the better ways to motivate people to create wealth so that there is more wealth to distribute, and that is really the challenge of Cuba.
How is the government of Cuba financed? They seem to disperse funds very generously. What's their national debt?
I believe they have a $2 billion national debt, And the main ways that they make money are, number one, through a biomed. They have a very developed biomed system where they export biomedicine. And secondly, through tourism. If you've ever been to Varadero, it's like Acapulco, a string of hotels where Europeans and Canadians primarily go and enjoy the beautiful beach of Varadero. And then third, through actually exporting medical personnel. That's their biggest third source of income, is in addition to helping countries with medical personnel, they actually also rent their doctors and get a fair amount of income from renting their doctors to other countries around the world.
When you're talking about income inequality, I'm wondering a couple of things. One, that what percentage of the income in Cuba comes from the United States from relatives of Cubans? When I went to Cuba, I stayed in an apartment building that was the son of the apartment building owner got money, a lot of money from her relatives in the States, and I think that's how she owned the apartment. And I'm wondering what kind. She also had another place, so I don't know about how, owning just one thing. I'm just wondering.
You're a family member.
Okay, so there seems to be contributing to the disequality, this income from the United States versus people who don't have that source?
Yeah, we don't know the percentage, but a lot of people get remittances from the United States from relatives. They also get, a lot of people get just their family sends goods over to them from the United States. So it's kind of like a Cuban doctor is paid on the Cuban peso system, and they were telling us their monthly income is like 35 American dollars. So, you know, a lot of things are paid for by the government, but that income is, you know, if somebody sends you 100 American dollars, that's 3 times what a doctor makes. Yeah, it is huge. They have a 2-tiered money system, which is the more expensive tier is tied to the dollar. They used to use the dollar, but now they had this 2-tiered system instead. So it's you get American money, you just have a lot more wealth, definitely.
And one thing I'll add to that, when they did a study of remittances in Cuba, they found that Afro-Cubans only received 8% of the remittances. So it also creates racial inequality. The remittances primarily come from white and mestizo Cubans that left the United States. That left Cuba, excuse me.
Richard, just a quick question. You mentioned that Jim Bell was carrying legislation to establish a public bank. Could you comment on that a bit more?
We met with Jim Bell a month ago through the South Bay Progressive Alliance. The South Bay Progressive Alliance, there's a brochure over there. We've been in existence for 1.5 years trying to elect local corporate-free candidates. And we've created a number of what are called action teams. One of them that's new is the Public Banking Action Team. It's met for 7 times now. In the offices of Human Agenda, and we met about a month ago with Jim Bell, and he agreed to carry a bill. However, there needs to be another bill passed first in the next election cycle. Jerry Brown already said he would not support that bill, and Gavin Newsom said he will. So we can expect, I think, next year, about a year from now, to see some action on removing the barriers to the creation of either a California public bank, or what we're working on is joint power agreement local banks. For example, the city of San Jose with the county of Santa Clara and the city of Palo Alto and the city of Santa Cruz in a joint powers agreement, creating a bank for the benefit of everyone and not for Wall Street.
Well, time's up for a Q&A. Let's give the speakers a big hand.